Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this great Brennan Center event here at NYU School of Law. The Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute which is affiliated with the law school. I assume since many of you are here, you know the work that the Brennan Center is doing, but I urge you to take a look at their website and material. They're doing really first-rate important work on issues like voting rights, redistricting, and much, much more. But tonight we're here. I'm Julian Zelizer, by the way, and I teach at Princeton University. I'm a historian and a professor of public affairs, and I'm going to moderate tonight. Our guest, though, the person who you came to see, is Alexis Coe, and she's a terrific, terrific writer, and we're here to celebrate and mark the publication of her new book, which has definitely one of the best titles. You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington, which is out recently by Viking and getting a lot of terrific press. It's really, really a wonderful book. It's not only a good presidential history, and we'll talk about this, but a new approach to thinking about how do you write presidential history, and what does that mean in this day and age. She's also a consulting producer working with the esteemed presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin on a 3-part series about George Washington for the History Channel. She's the host of No Man's Land, a terrific podcast from The Wing and Pineapple, and co-hosted Presidents Are People Too. So we're going to have a great discussion, but before we do, please welcome Alexis Coe. So why don't we just start with the intention of the book itself. We'll get to George Washington, but from the title and from the picture on the title, you're clearly setting a different tone about a serious book about our founding president. How did you think about the book? Why that title? What were you going for?
If someone had told me, 10 years ago that my second book would be on George Washington, I would have thought they were insane. But I love presidential biographies, and I usually read 2 or 3 in conversation with each other. And at the end, I feel like I emerge with not only an understanding of the man, but also the approach to him. When I finished George Washington biographies, I never felt that way. And because I read them in conversation, I felt as if people who wrote these biographies almost took a pledge, that they would all have the same thesis, they would proceed in the same way, and they also had these fixations that seemed odd to me. And when I started looking into them, because it's not that difficult to check sources, historian or not, especially with the founders, there's something called Founders Online through Library of Congress. I very quickly realized that they had just repeated certain things, they had taken other things for granted, and that these fixations had created biases, like a bias, and then what they did was they missed other things. So there were all these opportunities that they just completely didn't see. It was sort of this monomaniacal mission to protect George Washington, to revere him, to treat the subject of a biography in a way that I'm not totally comfortable with.
And what's outside of the books on George Washington, what's an example of a book of presidential history that you like, that had an influence on how you understood the field, or that just got you into writing about presidents, or even thinking about doing that?
I mean, there are so many. I mean, I love Doris's books, but they're very different. They talk a lot about leadership and qualities. She also picks heroes. I think that I tend to like micro-histories, and I think that certainly influenced this biography. Micro-histories are approaches that are focused on issues like, for instance, Jefferson and Sally Hemings, slavery, Indians, these other groups that have either been ignored or minimized or dismissed or viewed as not as important as the man himself. But what I realized, what I loved about microhistories is that you could get the whole history. You could get the entire, casket, cradle to casket story in about 700 pages, fewer. And that, to me, was definitely appealing. And then I started to think about, I couldn't suggest a George Washington biography, but I could suggest great books on Chester A. Arthur. And that seemed, at odds with what I understand our collective, knowledge to be, our memory. And I thought about, who reads presidential biographies. And this also happened, I proposed the book before Trump was elected, but I had begun to think of the way that people talked about my interest in presidential history, sort of that it was odd, and it vexed me a little bit, as if it was like a peculiar interest that I had, and I didn't think that it was that strange. I knew plenty of other people who were interested in presidential history. They just weren't young women or people of color. And I felt like that was the fault of the historians, because if history is boring or if it is exclusive, if it excludes certain groups, then that's the historian's fault.
And I'll say, we're going to turn to George Washington now. The book itself, not only is it not incredibly lengthy tome, and I say that in a good way. It's a really engaging read, and by the size, usually presidential history these days, 1,000 pages plus, so you're not really in the field. But even inside the book, it's visually different. You kind of have material and little, not sidebars. Did you think about that as part of what you were trying to do?
The way I've mentioned that these biographies start out the same way, in which they declare, well, George Washington is too marbled to be real, and then we're going to break him out of this mold, or we're going to break the marble and start to really understand who he is. But they then would describe for 20 or 50 pages his body and his thighs, and so I've come to call them the thigh men of dad history. And what was at first that struck me as funny. It's funny, and I hadn't really intended that to share that with everyone else, much like the title, which I'll get to. I'll answer that question, but I thought, okay, he's a challenging person to write about, because he wanted to protect himself he wanted to be in charge of his legacy, because they're proceeding the same way. I was sort of trying to figure it out. And so I began to make these lists of things that helped me understand who he was. Who was he friends with? What writers did he like? What did he drink? What did he eat? Animals. He called his dogs Sweet Lips. There's nothing marble about that. And so I compiled these, and then I thought a lot, as I did with my first book, my experience in exhibitions, that it's such a shame when I get to go in the archives and then I just describe everything to people. I think there's a lot of use in that. That's our job. But sometimes it's really, the story is best told and enhanced by other things, like lists, or what we would call listicles now. His history books do have these visual elements, but they're often in the middle. They're sort of shoved in the middle, and they don't really do anything for you. And because I so wanted this to be a book that not only brought us closer to George Washington, but also invited people who do feel alienated by the genre I wanted them to feel like experts. And so then I started to realize that I had to show people my work in this way, and that I wanted it to not only be at the front of the book, but I wanted it to be at the front of each section, so that you would feel like, I've never read a book on George Washington, I don't really know the founding era, I know these things that have been made sort of fun and entertaining for me, and now I can proceed as an expert.
So, okay, and I think you definitely achieve this, and it is kind of a remarkable book to read on that front, in thinking about how you even do the genre. What's something about George Washington before he becomes president that tells us who he was just as a person? Who was this guy?
I think one of the fun things about George Washington that I didn't really think of before, he's a social climber. And that comes from a real desire, a real American story. He's a capitalist. But it also comes from a pretty rough upbringing, one of scarcity and deprivation. And that was another really interesting thing. Why don't we think about George Washington in the same group as Obama or Clinton or Ford or other people we talk about who are really informed by their upbringing by being raised by a single woman? But these biographies, these Thighmen would talk about his dad, Augustine, who died when he was 10, or his half-brother, who seemed to just be his most advantageous relation, and he didn't really seem to spend much time with him. But his mother's efforts were completely minimized. And so I really enjoyed seeing all of Washington's efforts to get ahead. And sometimes they were, fun. He really wanted to marry up. He was always writing to eligible women's fathers and trying to get them interested, and they were never interested. Then he tries to get ahead through the army, through fighting for the British. And I think that's so important to introduce people to and sort of walk them through things that we don't talk about a lot, like the French and Indian War, for example. So we understand that he would have done anything for the British, anything to get that commission. And had they given it to him, I'm not sure, we might be British subjects. And he tries and gets really impatient. So, everyone talks about him being guarded. He wasn't. That was something he really cultivated in himself because it got him in trouble when he was younger. And then he meets the rich widow of his dreams, Martha Dandridge Custis, and she becomes Washington very, very quickly. And I think that was what was most interesting to me is how differently, if his life had just gone slightly differently, if he'd gotten that promotion, if he had married into a family that had a royal commission to sell land in Virginia, if any of those things had happened, he would not have rebelled. He was reluctant. He was not ready to, he was not running, and I don't think any of the Virginia founders really were, eager to take up arms.
Was he someone who thought about weighty issues? Meaning, before he was he one of those people who was concerned about the community, whatever the government was doing? Was that the kind of person he was, or?
He craved. Washington wanted to be at the center of some story. That's absolutely true. And at first, that was Virginia's story. And how do you go about that in colonial Virginia? You run for the assembly. You go to every single church. People have asked me a lot about religion over the last couple of weeks. I call him a warm deist. If you had a church, he was going to show up because that was just good politicking. He was community-minded, but he also very much understood that that was the way to ingratiate himself and become a part of Virginia society. And then after a while, I do think that a lot of these things become a part of him. I think, the question is, did he really love Martha? Did he love her money? I think at first, certainly, he loved her money, but then I think he wanted her close to him at all times. I think he cared. He had a real sense of service, which is something we see develop in presidents over time. He had all those boxes ticked. It just took a while. Young George Washington, I would not like. I don't think many of us would.
Okay. Was he funny?
Not on purpose.
Not on purpose. So he wasn't like a jokey kind of person.
No, he wasn't.
That's not a myth.
No, there's dark humor. There's certainly dark humor when he's really frustrated with not getting paid the same amount as British soldiers because he was very much a second-class citizen as someone who was born in a colony. And he also just basically assassinated a French diplomat. He's about to start the French and Indian War. He doesn't get to the assassination. It's not on the first page. It's not on the second page. It's not on the third page. It's all just gripes. He's just complaining about, his pay and the food and the accommodations. And to me, that was pretty funny, but not ha-ha.
And what? So you recently were at Mount Vernon, and that's now an iconic place. What did it mean to him? Why was it significant, and what was his relationship to the place?
He inherited Mount Vernon when his half-brother died. Washington was the eldest son from the second marriage. In early America, that meant you got nothing. And so Lawrence, this half-brother, he was always sort of hanging out, hoping to, Lawrence had married well to sort of get connections, but Mount Vernon was a great boon to him. And when Lawrence died, he was able to rent it out for a while. And it was very stressful because, of course, he was a tobacco planter, and that never did well in that part of Virginia. Just it's not the right soil. It was really frustrating to him, but he had the estate that he really needed that bordered a lot of other very prestigious, much bigger estates to start socializing with people. And then later, Mount Vernon, as it's presented to me by the Thymen, when I would read about it, they would present Mount Vernon as his great escape, like in a really romantic sense, that he would be, fighting during the Revolution, or he would be in New York or Philadelphia, the first residences of the president. And he would just be thinking about, I'm thinking about what it's like to look out and, to sit in a chair and drink Madeira. And, that wasn't totally true. Washington was a serious businessman. I pity the fool who messed with his money. And he looked at Mount Vernon as a money-making machine, and he was obsessed with it. He was always writing about it. And a part of that venture, a huge part of his business, that was the hundreds of people he enslaved, and that's not really introduced when he thinks about Mount Vernon. And that was really important to me to understand what it was he saw on a daily basis. So Trump said that Washington had 2 desks. He didn't. There wasn't enough room in the New York residence. He complained about that a lot. But he did, in fact, operate his business at the same time. That's totally true.
We made it 20 minutes without talking about Trump, but there goes that game we were playing. Tell us who William Lee was, and you talk about that as an important relationship in his life.
Billy Lee, in the same way that Mount Vernon is romanticized as his escape, Billy Lee is the token enslaved person who people talk about to keep slavery close to the narrative, and also present Washington as, it's always sort of strange to say, but as a kind master. And he's presented as someone who maybe Washington inherited when he was young. Sometimes there's very odd phrasing that Billy Lee and his brother Frank they were sold to Washington as if he was just like, fine, I'll take them. It wasn't a passive thing. Washington went to Alexandria to purchase Billy Lee and his brother Frank, who was a butler, 15 years before the Revolution. So it was a relatively recent relationship. And Washington thought he was exceptional. He was an excellent horse rider. He was a great athlete, like Washington. And so he does treat him differently. And upon his death, he's the one person Washington emancipates. But that's always presented as, Washington emancipated all his slaves upon his death. And that's not true. There's only one person. And yet, while Washington thought of Billy Lee as exceptional, he was crippled in Washington's service, and once through a fox hunting accident, another during the war. And instead of taking Billy Lee instead of taking him to New York and then to Philadelphia, he instead leaves him at home, and he, gives him a different job and replaces him with a younger man. And so I found all that really interesting, the way that Billy Lee is sort of built up, and then how quickly Washington sort of, he feels as if he gives him his due and his will, but he's not really, he's not treating him in the way that one would think based on how important he's presented to the readers.
And you talked about this briefly, but Martha, what's your take on their relationship and its significance to this story?
Martha also, we envision Martha not as a young woman. We sort of envision her as always wearing that bonnet and being an older woman. And of course, that's not true. They met in their late 20s, and she was a really strong force in their marriage. But she was not someone who enjoyed the spotlight. I don't think either of them did, but when she was, before we called them the First Lady, she was in fact, the First Lady. She's got a ton of jobs that she's not really interested in. She was very into, she lost a lot of children, both her own children and then children she adopted. The Washingtons had so many children, even though Washington didn't have any biological children. And that was what she wanted to do. She wanted to remain in Virginia, and she wanted to raise children. And instead, she has to travel. He always wants her nearby during the war. She has to get inoculated. She's deathly afraid of that. And then she has to just entertain nonstop. And there's one really revealing letter in which she writes to one of her adopted, her niece, who she is very close with and she regards as a daughter. And it was sort of heartbreaking. She said, I think that this job would be so much better, because she does think of it as a job, for a woman who was younger and a little bit more vivacious.
What about their relationship itself? What did you learn about that?
We don't know a lot about their relationship because, like a lot of founding couples, they burn their correspondence. They were not separated as much as Abigail and John Adams.
When did they burn them?
Martha burned the letters when Washington died, and it must have been some agreement that they had. She doesn't attend his funeral, which I find really interesting, and I think that's because she felt like her service was done. She no longer owed the country anything. But what we do know is that a couple letters have been found. One was stuffed in the back of a drawer, always really exciting stuff for historians. We know that he called her Patsy. We didn't know that until recently. And that he did want her around all the time, and that he showed a great amount of care and concern for anything that was important to her, whether it was the food that she liked, the accommodation she liked, her children. He was effortful, like endlessly effortful with her children. And she, I think because of her experience with loss, did baby her children and did want them near. At one point, they're raising another child, a grandson, Washington. And he's not doing well. He moves from Columbia to Annapolis, and he's sort of failing out of every school. And Washington is lecturing him about like losing his umbrella. He's announcing in a letter he wants to marry a merchant's daughter. And Washington really wants him to stay at school. And Martha brings him home and hires a bunch of tutors. So I think as a couple, their contention was over raising children, definitely. But otherwise, it seemed lovely, and they seemed very much aligned.
And when he becomes president, what did the presidency mean at that moment to him or to the people around him?
The founders conceived of the presidency with Washington in mind, and Washington, is marking up the Constitution. He's writing president. He's annotating things. No one has ever occupied this office and this space, which is forever moving. And so he's establishing the office as he goes forward. And that means figuring out, who will he go to for advice. And so at first he follows everything by the letter of the law, and he tries to talk to Congress. He sends questions ahead of time, just like he did during the war. And they're overwhelmed by his presence. They don't know what to do. And it's one of these rare moments where Washington just completely loses it. And he yells at them. And they won't give him an answer. And he's like, why did I come here? Because he is a general. And I think that was one of his greatest challenges as a president. He was used to listening to a lot of opinions and then handing down his answer and expecting everyone to fall in line. And that just didn't happen. So he was naive, and he thought, okay, I can sort of put together this, team of rivals. Jefferson, who is a Francophile and wants sort of a loose organization. And then there's Hamilton, who believes in strong central government and, wants to mimic everything about the British. They fight, and Jefferson will later describe this, which I found really jarring, as a cockfight. And Washington is looking over, and he's he's basically watching them draw blood from each other. And of course, this was going to spill on out into the street. And of course, this was going to be talked about, and it was going to inflame partisan tensions. But Washington truly believed he could just be this unifying figure. He could tell everyone that, he was going to make the best decisions and tell them to get along, and it would all be fine. And instead, what happened was the birth of our partisan nightmare, which we think is terrible, but was definitely very bad back then.
And you say he carried around a copy of the Constitution that was marked up?
He did. He annotated it. It says President, and he's the most lovely handwriting, which as a historian, as you know, is really nice. His signature in particular is lovely.
And what did he do with that? I mean, was he trying to follow what he should do? Is this a little rule book?
He was, and then he had to get creative. So, for example, consulting with Congress didn't work. He didn't have time to write lengthy letters to people and then get responses and then, follow-up questions. Nothing would ever get done. So he established the cabinet, as I've discussed, and he, at times sidestepped the Constitution. When there was a rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, it was the rebellion that never was, he got really excited. And a part of this is Hamilton. He's always listening to Hamilton. And it's not because Hamilton, has cast a spell on him, which is sort of what Jefferson and Madison and that whole crew thought. It's that he believed in fundamentally in Hamilton's worldview and this idea of really strong central government. And Hamilton gets all up in arms and literally and says, if the government is showing force, it has to come out like Hercules. And Washington, in something that has never been repeated, sidesteps the Constitution, gets a judicial writ, rides out with the state militia to confront these whiskey producers in rural Pennsylvania and Kentucky, and thinks better of it at the last moment, like, oh, I'm president, I probably shouldn't be seen drawing arms on my own people. He's not riding on a horse at this time because he is, an older man. He's in a very fancy carriage, but he turns around, which is really good because when they got to the field where actually he had a wonderful moment when he was in the British service, there's pretty much no one there. They had thought there would be, 6,000, 7,000 people. There's no one there. They really have to work hard to round people up. Jefferson, Madison, they're all talking about it. They can't believe that he would do this. The papers go wild, and it's rough for Washington. He's very sensitive about criticism, but he also just can't let it go. The next time he addresses Congress, he talks about, these factions were definitely influenced by foreigners, and he just cannot stop inflaming tensions, even though he doesn't want to. That's his stated goal. He's against it.
And how does he think of power? He's in this new position. It's a new institution, a new country, and then he has the power that he couldn't have imagined 10 years earlier, 20 years. How does he think of the power that has been given him at a personal level, not at a formal institutional level?
I see Washington's ambition, his sort of reckless ambition, in the way that he was so demanding, and it wasn't a good look. I see that subside when he becomes the general. I think he did, he had sort of everything that he wanted. However, and he didn't want to be king, and he's very sensitive about that. And we have a monarchy-wary country. We've just fought this long war, and we're trying to be this model of democracy in the world, in a world of monarchs. He doesn't want to be king. That's how he and Adams have their first, little tussle. Adams goes. He decides that, Washington should have a very fancy title, His Highness, and it goes on and on and on. It's totally ridiculous, and it's very embarrassing. And Adams never shakes this, both being known as someone who loves royal titles, and also he never earns Washington's trust. They were, sort of an odd coupling, but it could have been great. They complemented each other in so many ways. But that's how, as Adams sort of famously said, the office of the vice president is, basically irrelevant because of him and his sort of early actions. So Washington is at the same time feels very comfortable with his power. He doesn't want to be a king, but he also has these impulses of a general where he does want to control things in this way that just doesn't work, and we don't see again until we have another military leader.
So the myth about him which revolves around his giving up his power, that is true.
That's absolutely true, and he did so readily. He didn't want it. I truly believe that. When he, in 1775, when he and the other founding fathers, meet and Lexington Concord has happened, he wants to be the leader of the revolution. He, stuffs himself in his old uniform, and he's like, oh no, I couldn't possibly. He's going around to every church. He's going to every house. He's a busy man. He's running for general. When he gives up power, he wants to go home, and he really wants to be home by Christmas. And he is serious about that. He also, Mount Vernon has fallen into disrepair. It hasn't been. Nothing is ever as well managed as he wants it to be, but it really isn't. And I think he just wants to live a quiet life. But then he watches, in the book I talk about it as sort of like a pregnancy. He carried the country to term, and now it's the 4th trimester, and he needs to make sure it's happy and healthy. And so he sort of gets dragged back into it. But every time he's given up power, he absolutely wants to, definitely. And when he leaves the presidency, it's his choice. We set limits there, 4 years, but that could have gone on for quite some time. He's done. He doesn't even want to stay for 8 years.
Does one of the, I can't remember, I thought you had a chart in your book, and maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I'm right, on people who liked him before and who don't like him, who know him by the end of his presidency. It's a great part of the book. Can you walk us through a few of those and why you wanted to highlight that part of him?
The founders, we hear.
Do you have a chart on that? Or
yes.
A little? Yeah, you do.
Frenemies.
Okay. I thought I was from
Frenemies.
That's
yes.
right. I knew it was something good. Yes.
We hear about the founders so much, and they're presented as a monolith. They were a group of guys who were fighting for the same cause, and they won independence, and they went forth with this vision, not only of how the country should be, but how the country should be now and how we should all live. And that's simply not true, and I think one of the best ways to understand that is the relationships that existed before the presidency and then, by the second term. And so, there's so much praise because Washington was, all the founders thought he was the only guy for the job. And he was remarkable. He had something that the thing that bothered me about, 50 odd pages devoted to his manliness or how he, was regarded. He had something we still can't describe with someone we meet at a party, which is he was charismatic. He had something that attracted people to him. And they would describe him in the loftiest of terms. He was practically a god. And then everything goes to hell, and it's just like a burn book. So with Thomas Paine, for example, during the Revolution, he is talking about how Washington is one of the most amazing people who has ever lived, that he has the morality of a saint, that he is to be trusted with power, with basically anything that is important to any individual. And at the end, he calls him a fraud and, says that, the world will uncover what he's really about. Same with Jefferson, nothing but praise. And at the end, he basically says, well, Washington is going to emerge unscathed like usual. Nothing sticks to him. So there's a lot of resentment. And there's divisiveness. And it's true that a lot of them didn't say it to his face, but it wasn't that hard to figure out who people were who were writing these anonymous essays. And eventually, Washington does confront someone like Jefferson, and they never speak again.
Did he think of himself as a founding father? Is that a term? We use that term all the time. But does that reflect the mindset of who they were, given they didn't know where everything was going to go?
I think they thought of themselves as patriarchs. But I don't know. I don't think, he didn't think of himself as the foundingest founding father.
Well, how uncertain were they, or was he, about where this was all going to unfold, meaning the Republic?
I think they were pretty nervous about it. Particularly Washington. The thing about setting up these institutions is he was quite aware of how fragile they were in a way that we would do well to consider. if someone holds on to power, for example. Any of these things could destroy the nation. And also, this was their entire premise. The British Empire was corrupt. It had fallen into decay. And that was their greatest fear. That his farewell address is quite famous and certainly has been quoted often of late because it seems really relevant, which is that he warned against unprincipled men who were obsessed with power and only cared about keeping power. Not about helping out and achieving goals for the country and for citizens who were land-owning white men at the time. He talks a lot about foreign influence and how it's quite dangerous. So I think he left pretty worried about the whole thing. They called it an experiment for a reason.
I have to ask, what was he fearful of in terms of foreign influence? How did he, from the perspective of your work on Washington, what does that mean?
The Whiskey Rebellion, which I've already mentioned, was very clearly, the irony is amazing. These men were issued a tax. A lot of them didn't own land. And of course, you couldn't vote if you didn't own land. And they also didn't really deal in cash. So they, like the founders from Virginia, they didn't have cash. They were cash poor. So they paid their rent to these landlords in the cities, in agricultural goods, in whiskey. And Washington, even though it's quite clear what was going on, he ostensibly had heard, no representation, no taxation without representation. He blames foreign influence for the Whiskey Rebellion. There was a good part of the population who believed that we should support the French. We wouldn't have won the war without the French. Then they have their own revolution. Thomas Paine sort of revolution hops. He goes over there. That's why he gets so mad at Washington. He gets thrown in jail, and Washington doesn't help him. And so Washington saw these groups of people wearing their French pins and their British pins, and he thought, this could destroy the country. And it's not like this was just, they were seeing this thing happening abroad, they were getting dispatches. The first French ambassador who he allowed in the country didn't go and pay his respects. He went on basically a tour of America trying to rile people up against Washington. So the threat of foreign influence was very real to him. And he also felt like if you have ties to a foreign country, whether it's because of a, quid pro quo, whether it's for some other reason, then you're not going to act in the best interests of Americans.
And
so it's fairly straightforward in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and all right, I'm not going to go to today, but I do want to ask, when did you start writing this book?
I started thinking about writing it in 2015. I think I started in earnest in 2016.
2016. Why did you decide that you wanted, this is different than your first book.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide you wanted to move in this direction, but why did you want to write about George Washington the year Obama's presidency was ending, before Trump was president?
It is and it isn't different than the first book. I think it seems really different, but I've always been a political historian more than a presidential historian or a women's historian or all these other categories I hear myself described and put in. I felt as if his story had been told poorly, or at least for me, that there wasn't, I wrote the George Washington biography I wanted to see in the world. And I felt like that was really important, but I did, however, think that when I was at a symposium in Mount Vernon the weekend before the election, and I had just bought a notebook from HillaryClinton.com, and it said, first woman president or something on the cover. And I was taking notes in it. And I did have this moment, which I don't usually, I'm not really nostalgic, and I don't give into this, but I did have this moment where I thought, how interesting, I'm going to be writing a book on the first president while living through the presidency of the first woman. Of course, things went very differently. I think I wanted, for all the reasons I've said to write this book, that I really wanted a different kind of presidential biography to exist. I think that I couldn't have anticipated how much curiosity there would be about the presidency. We're constantly asked as presidential historians, they can do that, he can do that, this is possible. I think there's a real hunger to understand the presidency, and there's no better way to understand it than the guy it was made for and who created so many of these precedents. And so I really wanted that to be accessible. And I think that in general, the genre needs to change. And this is what I hope is the first of a contribution of many. There are too many presidents for me to do. So I hope that this is the start of a trend. And I hoped that it would appeal to two very different groups. I hoped that my peers, other historians, would think that it was good and interesting and serious. And I also hoped that it would appear playful and different and approachable to people who are, frankly, not dads, who don't buy books, don't get books purchased for them on Father's Day, or, sort of have these large tomes, these things we, associate with dads. And going around to all these different places, to Mount Vernon, to, a bookstore on the Haight, to just completely different venues, and seeing people embrace it and get excited about it has been extremely gratifying.
So you started by talking about the more canonical presidential historians who have dealt with George Washington and your criticism of him. So kind of coming back to that, after bringing back and discovering the person who George Washington was, after looking at him as a human, not just as a statue, how does your conclusions about his presidency, his legacy, his impact, how does it differ from some of those works some people might be familiar with?
I don't feel the need to protect George Washington. He's just fine. He's going to be fine. There's no way that I could really hurt him. And so I've been called a reverend a lot over the last couple weeks. And at first I thought that was great, and I still think it's quite nice. But the question is, why is that remarkable? Why do we accept that biographers revere their subject, particularly when it comes to a president? If we emerge with an understanding of someone like George Washington, who, if he's marble, it's because we've made him marble, because he's been presented as perfect. He's described this way by his contemporaries and by historians, even in the last decade. If we understand that he was a bunch of things that didn't make sense, that he made a lot of mistakes that we can see quite clearly, but that everything was okay, we survived, that it will continue to be okay. I think that's really important, and that's what we can take away from his presidency, that he was not all-knowing, none of them were all-knowing, but there are certain attributes that are really important. There's no president who has occupied the office while I've been alive who has been perfect, who hasn't had really obvious faults. And I think that we would do well to remember that the founders were like that too.
Well, in some ways, it's a post-1970s look at presidents, but also from a newer generation, meaning it is not totally revering who the person is, it's understanding their flaws, it's understanding the problems of the inhabitant, but it's not totally kind of cynical and 1970s mentality. It's somewhere in between in terms of how do we now look in a more realistic way at who these people are.
Balanced.
Yeah. Fair and balanced.
Yes. As much as they can be.
And if there is the one part of his presidency, one lesson, and people I'm sure ask you this, with your realistic take on him, that you'd want other people to think about at least, and to digest and glean from this time, what would it be? He
wasn't certain about the survival of America. he was invested in it in ways, he's the father of the American mule because he was convinced that it was integral to American farming. He cared about America and he cared about service in a lot of different ways that weren't perfect, but were really important. And I think that is something that I think about a lot when I think about, he cared about Americans, only a certain part of America. All of those things are true, but in the end, he struggled to be better. He wasn't born great. He wasn't destined to be great. He wasn't destined to be president. That denies him a lot of the work that he was doing throughout his life. And he didn't achieve all his goals. He didn't achieve all my goals for him. But he was trying pretty hard in a really genuine way. And that is something I can't say for everyone.
Well, we have time for some questions and answers, and we have mics that will be going around. I don't know where the mics are, but please raise your hand high and keep the questions short and to the point. And so we have time for as many as possible. The mic will come to you. Just raise that hand so they can see you. Or they're putting it up. Maybe just go back there to ask. Go ahead.
Hello. First of all, happy early Valentine's Day. Like, when I heard about George Washington Bridge, and they named every time I've been around New York, I heard they named George Washington Bridge, and. I know about George Washington's birthday was February 22nd, day after my birthday. When I heard about I know about George Washington's bridge. He was the first president of George Washington's bridge, and the question is, when did George Washington was born and when did he die?
Oh, I can answer that. So we used to use a different calendar, and I'm sure everyone really wants to hear about the Gregorian calendar, but I'll control myself here. February 22nd, he was born in 1754, and then he died in 1799, so just a little bit before, in early December. And for the amazing physical specimen that he was, he pushed himself to the limits to the very end. And he went out for a ride around all the various farms in the rain and got sick and still went out again. And then the worst thing a person could do for you at that time in America was call a doctor. And they called a bunch of them. The doctors were often also barbers or overseers. And Washington did not help the situation because he kept asking to be bled over and over and over again. And it's really gruesome. I go into it because it's like a performance of death. And it says a lot about him and who he was as a person. So that's when he died.
Hey, Nick, thank you. Next question.
Hi, Alexis. How are you? I'm Diana, Talk with Diana TV. Question, you mentioned when you wrote the book, you thought we would have a first woman president. Now that you know we haven't, are you planning to write another book about our present president?
No. Absolutely not. I do not envy future historians.
Well, maybe pass in 4 years, so,
No.
Not going to challenge it? You have
I
to
hope that I
compare.
think a
You have to
lot
do a
less.
comparison. I want to see
Direct answer.
a
No,
relation.
absolutely not. It's funny. I was asked earlier today if I liked what, I've never actually written about someone who I really like. I think that sounds nice. I definitely would not write about Trump. Even if they're complicated characters who I've written about, but they, there's some struggle, there's something going on that's interesting, there are dynamics at work. I I couldn't live with him. You guys know that we live with him now. I wouldn't want to spend more time with him than I already do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good question.
Hi, my name is Jason. You were talking about presidential historians and presidential biographers, and I'm just curious as to your thoughts about my favorite, which is Robert Caro and the books on LBJ. So just curious as to what you think of him and his books.
I think that Caro, it's interesting. I've read Doris a lot on LBJ, and obviously she had a very different relationship with him because she worked for him. Caro is incredible. I loved working. I think maybe his wife should get a little bit more credit than she does. I think he's great. I don't know if we're ever going to get that final volume, but I like him. He has his different problems that are for a different time, but for the most part, I would say that the way he does history is incredibly thorough, and much as I have, I had a real intention with the way that I thought about this book and the presentation of history and what I, how I wanted to craft the story and what I wanted to happen in the genre, and that's something that I definitely think of Caro as also having all these intentions and devoting himself fully. I mean, he moved to LBJ's town. I don't know if I could talk my husband into that, but that's amazing. So I think that, he's in a different category, definitely.
I'd say there is a similarity in what they're doing, what you're doing, in that you are both in different ways trying to imagine an innovative way to tell these stories. For him, it's seeped in journalism and a real riveting kind of narrative approach, and I think that's been part of his contribution. And you are kind of physically and in terms of focusing on the humanity of the president, you're trying to do similar things to open up these narratives and to reach broader audiences. So there is a kind of thread between what both of you are doing that I think is interesting.
I'll take it.
That's my take. Okay.
Hey, Julian. Hey, Alex. My name is Ophir. What I'm curious about when we're thinking about presidents is the way that the media depicts them. And I'm really curious about the media of the time of the 18th century. If there was at all media, how were they covering the first president of the United States?
There was always some form of media, and Washington, during the war, was really good at it. I have this chapter called The Court of Public Opinion, and he knew exactly what kind of stories needed to be collected in order to win, what we would call a hearts and minds war. So any sort of British atrocity was really important because, just like the founders weren't all in agreement, the country wasn't in agreement about how they felt about the war. And so, you needed to point out that no one was safe as long as the British were around, particularly your daughters, your livelihood, any of those things, and that was essential. So I think he understood it quite well. What happened was that he lost control, right? And he wasn't disseminating the stories in the same way. He also didn't feel like he was nation building in this way, that he was, I don't want to say more invested in, but he was conscious of, I'm not just fighting this war, I'm launching our country. And in order to do that, I need everyone to have a really positive perception of the country and also regard us as a peer because we're joining countries that have been around forever. And he wanted to take place right with them. He was impatient when it came to that sort of thing, both on a personal and a national level. He wanted to compete always at the highest level. But then what happens is when I mentioned the cockfights that would spill out onto the streets. Those, Jefferson, Hamilton, they all started throwing money at these papers and they started writing under pseudonyms. Hamilton and American. There was one guy who was far more clever, Porcupine. And nothing was safe, nothing was sacred or safe by the second term. They went after everything. And it was brutal. He was really sensitive about it. He never commented on it, but Jefferson would write letters about how Washington took everything really personally and how he's never seen anyone be so injured by, printed words. So it existed, just not in the way that we understand it. And in some ways, it reached people faster because they were read aloud. If a paper reached a pub or a town or whatever, everyone gathered around to listen to what was going on. And if you only got one kind of paper, it's like if you only watched Fox News. You only got one perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So I became really interested in Washington when I went to Mount Vernon, and I noticed that nowhere in the house were there any indications of his religion, which I thought was really interesting for the time because, and I interpreted it as potentially that he was aware of how important he was for the founding of the country and influential he was to the public, and that it might sway the founding of the country and freedom of religion and that kind of thing. And granted, I think that I only have the history of George Washington from the Thigh Men's perspective. But between that and him resigning his commission and stepping down from the presidency, I want to know your opinion on whether he was just doing that for political views or because he really didn't want to be the president anymore. Or did he understand that he was setting a precedent for this new country and how people would behave based on his actions?
So the first question, religion, he was, I describe him as a warm deist. We see him quoting from the Bible, and what's interesting is he's usually quoting things that his mother also quoted or that we see annotated in her Bible. The Bible should have been there, and if it wasn't, it was probably at the presidential library across the street. But he did have, Bibles around it. Martha was far more religious. If you look at letters in which, they're being informed, the Washingtons are being informed that someone in their family died, the letters that they both receive are very different. Martha's are about God and about an afterlife. Washington's are not. They're more pragmatic. But he did talk a lot about providence, and he believed in that. But he didn't talk about an afterlife. There was never about, he didn't say, I'm going to be reunited with my brothers or my father or my mother. He never talked about that, which I thought was really interesting. And then the second part of your question, can you repeat the second part?
Well, I guess, so you said that he even went to different services of different religions. So I'm wondering, do you think that all of those actions were him serving his own political whatever, or was it him understanding that he was setting a precedent?
So that's sort of what's remarkable about him. Sometimes he does something because it's very clearly a means to an end, and then it becomes, he internalizes it, and I think he really means it. So when he, it's 1775, and he's wants to be the general, he's going around to every church because that's where you meet people, and he's sort of glad-handing. And then he believes in, Madison is this really promising young man to him, and he believes in religious freedom, and he writes to, famously a synagogue in Rhode Island, and he meets with Quakers. Quakers want him to, end slavery. He's not going to do that, but he's open to all of this, and he encourages them to practice their faith. And I think he does that quite earnestly. I don't think he wanted to be told how and what he should believe in either. But I don't, this idea of him praying, kneeling and praying at Valley Forge and all of that, that's not true. I don't think that he was someone who, would today be going to a mega church.
I think it's great to expand history of people we think we know, but I also think you're probably fiddling with our origin story. Is that why people are thinking you're irreverent?
I think irreverent is said as a compliment. It's usually in the books to read in 2020, and so it's usually meant quite positively. I I don't think I'm fiddling with our founding story. I think I'm just looking at it in a way that I think is balanced. The way I assume the other, the people I call the Thymen and other historians, I don't think that they're trying to hide certain parts of our history from other people. I think they just are a bit more defensive about things, or they don't consider that to be a part of their worldview. They don't see certain things, they're not curious about certain things, and therefore they don't write about it. So I wouldn't say, I would actually I would turn that around, and I would say that people who present the founding era in this highly romanticized way are the ones who are fiddling with our story and presenting it with this really strong bias.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
We have a lot of the question as to what the Emoluments Clause means. I'm curious, did Washington export any of the products from Mount Vernon? And if so, did it continue during his presidency?
Ooh, this was a big issue. It's a good question. When he, a part of his frustration with the British government and what led him, it didn't happen overnight. The process of Washington becoming a rebel happened over, 20 years. And a huge part of it was that when he would ship things from Mount Vernon, at first tobacco, and then he gave that up, whatever the product was, it would leave in good shape, and it would get to London, and the purveyors there, because that's the only place you could sell, would say, oh, it's a poor quality. It didn't weigh as much as you said it did. They would sort of give every reason, true or not, to pay him less money. And so that was a big concern. Mount Vernon is still a business when he's president. He has various people running it while he's away. He's sending these links. He was a micromanager, and he's sending, all sorts of notes, just about everything. So he is exporting the whole time, but he's not really starting new businesses when he's the president. But what's really funny is when he leaves Philadelphia, where the president's house was, what does he go into? Whiskey. And he becomes one of the biggest whiskey distributors in all of America. He pays his taxes. He owns land, he votes, I hope. But whiskey. And you can go to Mount Vernon, and they won't ship, but they have a distillery. You can go as if you're wine tasting, and you can buy it there. It's very strong.
Before we wrap up, I'll ask about the title, which You Never Forget Your First is both funny, but it also actually conveys a point, I think, that you've been trying to make all night, and which is at the heart of the book. Can you just tell us briefly why you ended up going with that title?
When I realized I wanted to write a book on George Washington, that's not the easiest sell. And I thought very carefully about how to craft this pitch to my agent, who I say in the book, has very much supported my good ideas and not supported my bad ideas. And so I thought really carefully about this, and I knew I had to sort of catch him off guard. I couldn't just write Biography of George Washington. He would say, why? Why do we need this? And so the subject was You Never Forget Your First, and then the content said, I want to write a biography of George Washington. And before you say no, you can't talk about his teeth. You can't talk about the cherry tree. You can't tell me that he was president. I sort of named all those things, and then I said, now tell me what you know. And then he wrote back, he's sort of famous for these one-line emails, and he wrote back, okay, tell me more. And then it became a proposal, and I said, we'll just use this as a working title. It'll be good. It'll get people's attention, because everyone will ask, why do we need another biography of George Washington? And it just kept staying, because every time I gave a talk, it did exactly what it's supposed to do, which is people heard, you never forget your first, and they sort of looked at me, maybe thought I was writing a romance novel, I don't know. And then the subtitle would come, A Biography of George Washington, and then everyone would laugh. And they would ask me a ton of questions at the end. And they would ask themselves the same question. And so what I realized was that it might come off as a bit silly, but that it conveyed everything that I hoped for the book. And then Viking joined me in my sort of dissatisfaction with the George Washington portraits and commissioned this wonderful artist, Alexis to make an original portrait. And the lettering, it's just about as different as, in every way than every other Washington biography. And so it was, from the outside all the way through a pretty concerted effort. And the title was essential to it. And now I love it.
Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking her for this talk. The book, You Never Forget Your First, A Biography of George Washington. She'll be signing them. I'm Julian Zelizer, and please do keep up with the Brennan Center's work. You can find them at BrennanCenter.org. Follow them on social media. This is a great book. The Brennan Center is a great institution. Have a good night. Thanks for coming.